everyone, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and today we're going to talk about the fact that sometimes dye manufacturers reformulate their dye, which can alter the pigmentation, the final color, and even sometimes how the dye performs. And today we're going to take a practical look at this using a dye that I know from the supplier that it has been reformulated and has changed. And so we're gonna be diving deep into Dharma's Sea Spray again. I bought my original dye that I've used in a number of different videos in July of 2020. And we know that this dye can sometimes behave differently under different conditions, but ultimately it gives a very beautiful greenish blue muted color that I adore. The newer batch of this dye that I purchased in October of 2022, I bought after Dharma put up a note on their website that it's been reformulated and it's leaning blue. Now it's a color that already is fairly blue, so I'm curious if leaning blue is going to bring it more into a like alpine blue, baby blue eyes kind of direction. I always mix those two up in my head, or what. But today we're gonna compare these two dyes using just a couple different techniques. It's not gonna be a complete deep dive, but we're gonna see if they perform differently with swatching the dry dye powder, with speckling, and then with just kettle dyeing, how the colors may or may not feel different. So as we go, jump on in, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. Here we have our old and new dye lots of Sea Spray, and you do have dye lots of the dyes, at least on Dharma labels. I haven't checked to see if that's something that's on Jacquard. So if you had a batch and it has changed, you can try to see if someone else might have some of an older batch that you can buy from them or trade or something like that. But I love that the old dye lot number is this more complicated code and the new one is just 14. This is what the poster swatch that I buy from Dharma and I cut out and put on lids look like from, I guess, the old batch of the color. I don't think that the dye bath has been updated. And oh my goodness, how did I not ever notice that there were dye directions on the containers, on the labels that Dharma uses. So that's cool. And they do have good color advice where they do note that different batches can have different colors. And so when it's important to test the color before using it. So that is good advice. But anyway, back to the little swatch. When I buy new jars of dye, once this one it gets completely empty, then I'll use this lid on this jar to reuse the swatch versus cutting up another poster. I'm now wearing my deluxe rubber respirator mask, safety glasses, and gloves. And we're gonna measure out a gram of each of these powders. Visually, I will do crude swatches and some speckles first for the dyeing, but I thought it could be worth to just look at the actual powders and compare those. So the powder for the old Sea Spray is dark and like blue looking. But the powder, if the powder does look really different, that isn't necessarily an indication that the color is going to look different. Sometimes the powders just look different. This does. Does this feel bluer? I'll put the two containers next to each other. I did label the cups. Okay, the powders definitely look different. The new color looks more like blue, maybe a little more violet. The old one looks more gray. But now I'm gonna get some hot tap water so we can dissolve the dyes. I'm not worrying about the volume of water. I'm just gonna try to make it similar with these two colors. This is the old dye. Ultimately, the color is a little bit pastel. Like it isn't a super pigmented color. But again, I'm going to try to sort of mix these similarly. Now, I have found with Sea Spray that after I stir it, if I let it sit sort of in here, the color does shift with the blues not dissolving as quickly. So you always want to stir it really well right before you use it. And so this is my first time looking at this new batch, trying to dissolve it well. Right now, I mean, I'm wearing goggles. It almost feels weirdly greener, would be how I describe it right now, which feels weird because I would say that the old batch feels a little bit bluish. I'm going to try to get these with similar amounts of liquid. But yeah, I guess they're not feeling like super different to me yet. But let's look at the powders on some yarn. Right here I have 200 grams of yarn that I pre-soaked with no acid. And so I think what I'm going to do is add like a little bit of some vinegar onto it. And then we're going to come over and kind of squeeze it through. I'm going to add a little bit of water on here anyway. But this is my fast and dirty way to add acid into some yarn that maybe didn't have it before. Just squeeze and then let the yarn soak up some more of that water. Okay. Now I have these labeled. We've got old and new. And we're going to give each their own little side of the pan. This is going to be our new side, and that is our old side. We're going to start with our old. I'm going to come over, I'm going to take a little bit of the dye, and just with the straight dye powder, we are going to speckle on to half of the yarn. And some places I might add a little more dye than others. But then I'm going to come over here, add some larger clumps of the dye. There we go, spread it out. And this we're going to tap out. And so you can see something that isn't as bright as teal green. I don't know if this is going to show some of the breaking. This definitely is going to look, it looks like a little more yellow towards the center, a little bluer towards the outside. But this is just a very crude swatch and speckle of some of the old color. And I'm not sure how well the camera's picking it up, but it is a little bit more yellow here where the powder was added, and a little bit more blue where things have spread. But we're going to give those speckles some time to sink in. And I am washing my gloves. And we're going to take the new batch. I prefer the white jars to the dark ones. Okay, I would say initially the powder definitely feels darker when I'm adding it. At least initially. I wonder if this is like got more pigment in it. Like I see a little more contrast. Sometimes it's hard to see where powders land. And the thing about these swatches right now that make this crude is that there's a chance that I was adding more dye here. But maybe not. That actually feels a bit lighter. It definitely feels, there's some elements that feel similar, but also some elements that feel very, very different. I'm going to get a little more powder, bring that in over here. So at first look, I'm feeling a little bit more green. So I don't know. They are very, very similar. Like in here where it's darker, you can feel that the spread is definitely blue and the interior is a little bit green, like where that landed. The colors feel so similar that I don't think you could use both of them in a colorway and have some kind of dramatic difference. I still want to wait to see what I see with these speckles over here. I definitely see breaking on this one. So we're going to give this a minute, or maybe like 5 minutes, and then come back. It's been 5 minutes, and I think if I step back and look at this on the monitor versus looking in person, I do feel like this looks more blue. Certainly it feels a little brighter, less muted, but maybe I use more dye over there. But let's look at the speckles. With our old formula, we get a lot of blue and green speckles with the occasional pop of like a bright yellow. Sometimes it's hard to see both of the colors, but here in this section you can see the blue with little bits of green. So it does break with speckling. In the newer color, I see some of that bright yellow as well. And if I'm looking closely, I mean, maybe I see a hair less of the green, but the blue is always the dominant color. Maybe it's that little bit of yellow that gives the green. But I definitely see some green specks and some blue specks in here as well. So I'd say for speckles, it's very similar. I don't know, I guess maybe I was expecting something a little more dramatic. I'm gonna flip the yarn over. We may end up getting some spread with our speckles. Okay. We now have some areas that are a little bit white-ish. I am gonna take our 1 gram of the old dye. And now these were not mixed evenly, but I'm gonna take a little bit on my spoon and pour it on. So that's the old, and we're gonna do the same thing for the new. Trying to stir it up really well. And gonna trying to get a similar amount, but pouring that on. And yep, we've got the new here and the old there. I mean, again, there could be some differences in how they're mixed. Right now, I would say the old feels like it's more pigmented. And if I tap it out, I mean, I think it strikes really quickly. It's not getting like much brighter to me. But they're close. I would say that the new one feels a little more muted here, which is funny because I said it felt brighter before. But I don't think it necessarily feels more blue. I mean, if I literally try to put them next to each other, they're very, very close, but we'll have to do the kettle dyeing to really see how things are different. Okay, we waited a little bit. I was going and setting up the tonal dye bath, and I don't know, I'm feeling more color in here. Something seemed very soft at the beginning, and now it is feeling more blue. It feels more green at first, but now more of these blues have come in, and I'm seeing and feeling the more blue over there. I wonder if it is more pigmented. I put my deluxe rubber respirator mask, safety glasses, and gloves back on to just finish off these colorway. Doing some crude swatching near, I guess, either end of the yarn, and then some speckles more in the middle. I flipped the yarn and added more dye until I was satisfied with the color coverage. And then I went and steam set the yarn one at a time in a steamer basket to attempt to keep there from being any color transfer between the two skeins in case ultimately we do end up noticing some observations that make things feel more different. But so far, I mean, the differences are so subtle, I don't know if I'm feeling a huge difference. I'm setting up my steamer basket now, and I want to note for future Rebecca that one of these is going to be sitting out longer than the other before applying heat. But I'm going to wait for the steamer basket to get hot, so both of them will have at least 5 minutes of sitting here on the counter before I go and start steaming. But so that might shift the way some of the colors spread on one. So when we compare these two, we're going to be trying to compare the breaking and the hues, not how big or sharp the speckles are. In my dye pot, I have 24 cups of water and 6 tablespoons of white vinegar. And I'm going to come add our mostly 1 gram of dye. This is the new color. We're going to add it into the pan, and I'm going to rinse out this cup. Not very much color left. It dissolved very, very well. I'm going to add that in, stir things up, and we're going to wait for this to come to a light simmer before I add the yarn. Did I even say today that I'm using Knit Pick Switch DK yarn that's 100% superwash merino wool? Because that's what I'm using. My plan is to use the same dye bath for dyeing our tonal with the new dye and with the old dye, because I think that that ultimately will make the most sense for me. But we're gonna start with the new so we can see as much as possible. And given that I have been using sea spray a lot recently for another project, I might be able to feel if something feels different right away. Maybe. Maybe. But I'll be back once this is warmer. We are not yet at a simmer, but things are nice and steamy, so we're gonna go and we're gonna dye 100 grams. Ooh, see, that color feels regular. 100 grams of Knit Pick Swish DK. And I'm raising and lowering it because I've done some dip dyeing with the old sea spray recently, and I was curious. This does feel similar, but those are the first dips. So we'll see what kind of final color we get. Again, this was 24 cups of water, 6 tablespoons of white vinegar, and we're now gonna heat this for 30 minutes. All right, it has been 30 minutes, and I mean, this looks like a sea spray to me. There's like a hair of something in the dye bath. I'm not gonna worry about that as we put the old dye in, because I know, like, if you can't really see any color in there, then it's not gonna make much of an effect. I do maybe see a little bit of breaking in here, and it's labeled with an N, so we know it's the new. Now I'm gonna come over with the old sample and we're gonna stir it well. I'm gonna go rinse it out. Okay. Stir this up, and we're gonna come over with our O labeled skein. Okay, and we're gonna come and add this. It does soak up part of that color super, super fast. But that is what I'm used to, where you almost get like a glaze feel at first. I don't know if this color would do amazing for glazing, but amazing for glazing. But like the first dip in definitely ends up with a glaze feel. So maybe this is a color that you could dye something and then do just a quick glaze to get a quick sort of layer of color. But anyway, I'm gonna let this go for 30 minutes. It's been 30 minutes. We're gonna remove our yarn. Okay. We're gonna remove our yarn, set it aside. I don't know if it'll show up on camera. I do see some breaking here. And I just snapped the zip tie in a very awkward way. That was odd. Okay, I'm gonna turn off the heat because we're done with that. But now, actually we can look at the yarn. Okay, because I do see some differences in here. This is the old sea spray, that's the new sea spray. And in each we used almost an entire gram of dye. And I'm fairly confident, unless I didn't tear the new batch, that I did that. Actually, I'm gonna go back and even watch the clip on my camera to make sure. Okay, I checked. I did tear, which means like zero out the scale before I did it. I believe we have more pigment in the new one. The colors are very, very close. And in person, I would describe this as slightly more blue. Overall, it feels pigmented. It still feels blue-green, but it is a little bit more blue overall. Maybe there's just a little bit more blue dye in this mix than we had over here. So there are differences. I think that the differences between all the speckled yarn are going to be so subtle that we're not really going to be able to quantify that when we look at the finished yarn. But here, looking at the depth of shade, there is a difference, although it is a very, very subtle one. Okay, for the speckled yarn, I just took the old one right here out of the dye bath, and here is the new color. And it's hard to say. This feels more pigmented. The new one does feel more pigmented there, but when you're dyeing by feel, I could have also used more powder. So the results here aren't as conclusive, but using the dry powders, things are ultimately, I think, very similar. But again, maybe the new one is just a hair more blue, but just a hair. In a moment, we'll wash the cooled off yarn all together. I don't think we're gonna be looking for comparisons there. But then once the yarn is dry, we can try to look for some of these nuances that may feel a little bit more extreme, or maybe they'll feel like they're closer together. So I would say right now that the dye lot difference in sea spray doesn't make the biggest deal to me. A lot of things felt very similar, and if I didn't see them side by side, I don't think that I would know. But if you have a recipe that uses sea spray, you might need to use a little bit less of the new one than the old one if you're trying to color match. But there are other colors that do behave quite differently. And especially again, when it comes to speckling, if the speckles feel different because there's another pigment in there, either that doesn't strike as fast as it did before, or gives a rogue neon green speckle, which is something that can happen sometimes that there's not much you can do about it except for maybe cover it up after the fact. So things like that can become a bigger deal. So I don't think that this particular one is as huge a deal as other colors might be, but please let me know down in the comments below. Is sea spray a color that you've used a lot and this change, does it make a huge difference to you? I'd love to hear your thoughts. But again, my point of view on all of this comes from the way that I tend to dye by feel mostly versus using recipes. And so I guess it just stands to reason that if you watch a video that I've done of color mixing and you're trying to use that and the proportions aren't working right, it's possible our dye lots are different. And that's not something I've been recording for the videos or anything, but yeah, and especially since I have some dyes that I bought 3-4 years ago, it's very likely that my dye stocks are older unless like I otherwise mention it. So it's worth keeping in mind. Why is reformulation a big deal? If you are a home or hobby dyer dyeing for your own purpose, it may not be the end of the world when a dye formula changes. But if you are a small indie dyer business and you dye the same colorways over and over, and you have customers who depend and reorder certain colorways, when the manufacturer reformulates the dye, then that might make it impossible for you to continue making a colorway that is really, really popular. And that can be incredibly stressful. Now, depending on the technique that you're doing, you might be able to reformulate your own recipe by mixing a few different dyes together. But if you rely on a color for speckles and the dye now breaks differently, you might be out of luck. And so this is unfortunate. Now, I know that Dharma Trading Company doesn't mix their own acid dyes in-house. I believe they mix their own fiber reactive dyes. But sometimes there is no choice but to reformulate a dye because maybe a pigment gets way more expensive or it just becomes limited and isn't available. And so the people who are milling and mixing the dyes have to use a slightly different pigment to try to get close to the same color, but maybe it just doesn't quite work out to be an exact dupe. And that's unfortunately the way it is. The best that we can hope for is that a brand will put a notice on their website that it has been reformulated and what way the color is shifting. But it's not infrequent for dyers in, say, the Indie Dyer Business Owner Facebook group to comment on a dye, then ask if people have noticed that the new batch is behaving differently from the old batch. And so sometimes it's a little bit of a surprise, and you know, when it's your business, that kind of surprise when it's something otherwise you've used a lot of can be a problem. So what can you do about this? There's not a lot that you can do about it, except for purchase your dyes in bulk. If you buy more than 2 ounces of dye at a time, and so you buy a really big container, then that will last longer, but eventually you might go through it. Now, I personally have never purchased a jar larger than 2 ounces because it takes me a while to go through that, even with the colors I use often. And I sometimes receive samples and other things of dyes, so I've got plenty of dye. I don't reorder things a lot, but I also don't dye the same recipes over and over. And so it doesn't affect me a ton personally, it just might make me sad if I can't get a particular color anymore. But just like when you're buying yarn from, say, Knit Picks or something, there can be dye lot differences with the same yarn base the same color and presumably the same recipe that their bills are using, there can be, I guess, dye lot differences literally between different lots of dye that you might order from suppliers. And so there could be changes sometimes without there being a notification, and that's unfortunate. The positive of this is that the indie dyer community is a huge group of people who are very willing to help one another out. And so if a dye changes, there are other dyers who are happy to recommend colors that might be a dupe for the way the dye used to be, or share some of their favorites. And it may not work perfectly, but there are wonderful communities of dyers out there who are willing to help one another out. But anyway, there are other dyes that have been reformulated, and they're dyes that I think there's like Fire Red from Dharma. Maybe I had a weird clumping batch and I have a newer batch of that. And so I might do some other batch comparisons of old dye versus new dye. But unless it's something that I know well and have used a lot, I'm not planning to dive into every single dye that people say might be different. We're gonna wash all of our yarn together. And I'm going to bring another zip tie over for the old tonal, who is now unlabeled and a little bit tingly. But yeah, I mean, here that feels more blue for sure. At first, like, I wasn't sure, but the tonal, yeah, I totally see it more now, especially since the old one isn't steaming anymore. I don't know how much it's coming through on camera. It's still a very greenish blue, or like a green, maybe not a very greenish blue, but it's a green leaning blue versus a blue leaning green. But not the other one. I would also call, I don't know, more teal, so more in the middle maybe. But I'm not seeing any color bleed, and I just added some dish soap. But yeah, you can see that difference, that hue difference. I wonder, since those blues end up taking longer to make an appearance, I wonder if you were kettle dyeing, if you dyed it and removed it so you didn't let all those final blues strike, if that would bring it a little bit closer. But I don't know. So anyway, I'm going to finish rinsing out the soap. Then I'm going to put all the yarn through my spin dryer and hang it up to dry so we can see the final dry yarn in all of its glory. I think it took me a minute, but we got there in the end. Can you tell the old sea spray versus the new? Here is our new sea spray compared to the old. I think the new sea spray is both more pigmented and slightly more blue. There are some elements of these more blue tones in our old dye, and I feel like there's some elements that match this green in here as well, but there's no mistaking that it is different. The thing that is like really messing with my brain right now is that these differences feel similar to some of the differences with pores when I was playing with the sea spray and thinking about how if you didn't have a well-mixed dye stock, the color shifts as you move through. And so that's just what it feels like to me. As for saturation, I think it's hard to say for sure which one is darker. Maybe if I made it gray. I mean, here in this grayscale, it does feel like the old one is a hair darker, but if you've ever done any photo editing, you know that when you're converting an image from color to black and white, you can decide how much of each yellow and blue tone contributes to more white or more black. And so even this could be manipulated to make one look way more saturated than the other. So this filter is great, it's just not perfect. If we look at these swatches, we can see the differences between the old and the new as well. Not as much for the pigmentation, but overall the colors are more green in the old and we see a lot more of the blues in the new. Now these 4 skeins all together do make a really lovely set. However, I do plan to label them so that way as I list them in the ChemKnits Creations Etsy shop, you can know, okay, if I want the similar tone of the speckled with the semi-solid, I should go for B and D or A and C. Side note, I'm really glad I wrote letters down on these little pieces of paper. It means I have to do less editing of photos after, and I find that to be a really great little hack, even if I'm not gonna have all of the yarn in one listing. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and I really hope that this video was helpful. I don't plan to do a deep dive into every color people have observed has changed. This felt like a good one to start because sea spray is a color that sometimes can look different under different conditions, and so since it was one people were already having a funny time with, it felt like with the reformulation, people could, if they didn't notice what it said on the website, could not understand why the color might be looking different from what they've expected. As for how to shift the color to be a little more green again, I think sunflower yellow might be a primary, and it's a more like muted brown yellow versus a bright one. I wonder if a hint of that might help, but I don't know. I'd have to play around with it, and honestly, I don't have any plans to do that. But as I'm distracted with a tangent, as I was saying, if there are other colors that you feel have changed their formulas of, given that I have a lot of dyes that are a fair amount older, and thank goodness for email history so I can figure out when I ordered them back in the day, let me know in the comments if there's any other colors I should try to do a comparison. I'm unlikely to buy a new batch of a color unless it's one that I use often. So if it's a color that I have rarely used, I would say it's unlikely that I'm actually going to go buy more. However, I always keep track of suggestions that you guys make down in the comments, and so you never know, I might come across that again when I'm getting close to needing to do a reorder. Please subscribe, turn on notifications, and do all the YouTube-y things. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and thank you so much for watching. There is still time for you to order your 2023 Spring Mini Skein Mini Series yarn for it to arrive in time for the series to begin on June 5th. Every night during the SMSMS, I will be sharing a new yarn dyeing video featuring the dyeing of mini skeins. It's going to be so much fun, and there's even going to be dyeing of sock blanks, there are yarn mops, all kinds of fun stuff. You can find more details in the ChemKnits Creations Etsy shop. I'll have it linked down in the video description.